Welcome everybody to day 2 of EA Global Summit 2021. This is Juhi again from EA Global Summit organizing team. Firstly, thanks to everyone for your time and efforts in joining us for this session. This session is by Ian Michel from Ability Engineering. Ian has been using consulting and training people to work with enterprise architect for over 20 years, and he is also a co-founder of European EA user group. Today, he is presenting this session in the topic One League Connect. Kindly be informed that we will be muting all the participants throughout the session, and if any of you are having any queries, please use the chat window or question window to drop your questions to the speaker. The speaker will answer during the Q&A session at the end. To enable further collaboration and communication with Ian and also with other EA practitioners across the world following to the session, we request you to visit Ability Engineering meeting room in MS Teams. The link to MS Teams channel is posted in the chat window for your quick reference. If anyone is having any difficulty in connecting to Teams still, please reach us at registrations@eaglobalsummit.com. Maybe we have to add your email address as guest to invite you once again. Thanks once again for your interest and support to EA Global Summit 2021. Looking forward to another informative session with Ian in this year's summit. Over to you, Ian, now.
Thank you, Julie. Do I have to do anything to share my screen?
Yeah, I made you as a presenter.
My screen, marvelous. So yeah, let me know when you can see my screen and I'll start.
Yeah,
cool.
We can see
so this session is about traceability and explaining some things about what we mean by traceability, how it's useful, how we can accomplish it, and how we can get some value from doing it. This is a very short bit about me. Been doing EA things since version 2, but there's not many of us been in it since 3.5. And I also produce the eaDocx and Model Expert tools as well. So straight into what this is all about. So the presentation really is about advice to people thinking about building new kinds of EA models. And there's lots and lots of decisions to make and lots of things you need to think about. What we're principally going to concentrate on here is not the things that we need to model, but rather more the links that we might want to create between them. The subject of what kinds of things we use might be a topic for another conversation. But principally what I want to think about is this idea of traceability. And what most people seem to mean by traceability isn't necessarily the links between all those little funny boxes. It's the idea that I can take something at one end of my model and kind of have a virtual relationship to something at the other end. So I can say I create a business process at one end of the model, and suddenly at the far end of the model, I can see its impact on a change request. And that's something that I may not have known before. So that's what we're going to think about. How can we get business value out of those traceability kind of ideas using Enterprise Architect? So I think to get value, we need two things. We need to be consistent, our models, and we need the outputs from the models to be useful. And I'm going to take them in kind of that order. So look at the consistency thing first. So when I'm creating my EA model, how can I put in connectors, relationships there, and keep my model consistent? Then second half is going to be about how I can make use of those things and get some value from all that hard work that I'm putting in. So what do I mean by consistent? Well, I think we know it when we see it. It's if I look at a model and see the same style of modeling everywhere in the model. Because models where somebody in one project does things in one way and in a different project does it a different way isn't going to help me to get my traceability. It may be brilliant for one project and terrible for the next one because they've done things in a different way. And we'll look in a second what some of those style things are that can help me to do that. Another thing I look for in consistency in models is, am I using the clever bits of EA or just the obvious and clear ones? Because there's lots and lots of clever bits of EA. Those of us who've been using it for a while will know. And I have to say, I learned some more clever bits of EA yesterday listening to Gillian. So I absolutely encourage you to go and listen to her again. I also think making it easy to learn for new people is going to make your life a lot easier. So if you do use clever bits and exotic ways of doing connections between elements, then it's going to be really hard to teach that to new people. And that means those people are more likely to get it wrong. So if it's obvious and clear, you're more likely to get that similar style everywhere else. And if you do all those things, you're probably going to make your models a little easier to manage, because only if it's easy to manage are you going to get that uniform kind of structure. So what this session is all about is consistency of connections, not the particular element types in between times. So the first thing we can say about connections is, well, EA's got lots of them because UML has lots of them and EA is a UML tool. So please learn what the UML connection types do. I do hear people quite a lot say, oh, I use EA, but I don't really know UML. And you think, wow, how crazy is that? It's a bit like saying, oh, I drive a car, but I don't know the rules of the road. And you can probably drive a car without knowing the rules of the road for quite a while until you crash into something. So it's really a terrible excuse. And it's not just knowing that there are these bunch of little funny arrow types, it's what they mean. What does EA mean by dependency or a realization or a composite or an association? Because if you're using these kind of connectors in a different way from what UML thinks they are, that's almost worse than useless, because a new person coming in would look at your model and go, oh, he's using inheritance. And actually, if you're using it to mean something different, that's terrible. So please learn these things. There's any amount of UML knowledge out there and tutorials and guides and stuff. It's been around for donkey's years. 1997, I think, UML was invented. So there's no excuse for not knowing that stuff. But if you absolutely think, having learned all about all these brilliant UML relationships, that you need a new one because you're special, okay, EA will let you create new kinds of connector, to express new kinds of relationship. So here I am in the properties of my connector, and EA says, oh, look, this little ... thing, I can create a stereotype. Now, most of you will have done this loads of times. Here's a great big long list of my stereotypes. In the perspectives drop down, I could change perspective and I'm going to get a different list. Again, refer to Gillian's presentation yesterday about how to make use of perspectives to keep these lists as small as possible. So if I'm allowed to, and I don't see what I need in there, I may be allowed to create a new stereotype. Now, bear in mind, this is one of the things I believe that you can restrict in the security settings of EA. So you might choose to say, for most users, you're not allowed to create a new stereotype. It's just for special people like you and me. So you could create your new stereotype, and that's great, because that now becomes part of the set of stereotypes that we're allowed to use. So if I come across next time and say, here's another connector, and I look on the stereotypes, there's my new stereotype in the list. So if I'm one of those people that's allowed to create new stereotypes, it's now on that menu of stuff that my other users can do. And this is going to really help, because if you allow new users to go and create new stereotypes all over the place, they will. And the consistency of your model is gone. So EA is really giving you absolutely every chance here to keep your model consistent. So you're going to have to really do some work to make it inconsistent. But you'll find plenty of users are prepared to put in the work to make the model inconsistent. So let's look a bit more about some of the other kinds of relationships, because that's what most of us mean. We mean a thing, a connector, another thing, maybe a stereotype. How hard can it be? What could possibly go wrong? Well, I've looked at probably, I must be more than 100 models in now, and models that I've looked at over the last 20 years. And so these are just a few things that I've seen of things that exist. EA will let you do, that UML says that you can do, so that's probably fine. Some of them are things to avoid. Some of them are things you might see that you might just have to deal with. So let's have a look at most of these. So We'll start with the multiple relationships. A perfectly sensible and reasonable thing to do as far as UML is concerned and as far as EA is concerned. So don't let you hear me say that you mustn't do this. It's absolutely fine. It's just making your model quite hard. So if I'm allowed, as in this example here, to say that blue, oh, by the way, I should say I've chosen funny shapes and funny colors here because this applies to any kind of UML-based language you're using in EA. So these could be SysML things, they could be Archimate things, they could be just basic UML things, BPMN stuff. It doesn't matter. So I've deliberately not chosen very many particular examples. So if we say my blue triangles and my red oval things can have multiple kinds of relationship between them, that's cool. And as I start to produce more diagrams and more diagrams, it's going to get more complicated. And am I prepared for that amount of complexity in my models? I have a particular thing about Archimate as a language. I think it's far too complicated. And it's very, very fond of having lots and lots of different kinds of relationships between the same pair of element types. And I think it makes it really complicated because you have to really understand what those different relationships mean. So it's very rich. If you do your modeling in this way, you get very, very rich expressive models, but you're paying a price, I think, for complexity. The best example I know of when it works really well is RACI, a way of understanding relationships between stakeholders and requirements in more detail. And if your problem, RACI, by the way, is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. It's a fairly well accepted way of understanding relationships between stakeholders and requirements. If your problem is to do with stakeholder management and really understanding who should I consult about this particular requirement versus who's actually responsible for it, this is the way forward. So having multiple kinds of allowable relationship between a stakeholder and requirement, this is the way forward. So it really is useful sometimes. I think more people have this and it's an unnecessary complexity than actually use it really well. Bear in mind now, if I do this RACI approach, then every time I put in a requirement, I probably have to find 4 kinds of stakeholder to assign these relationships with. And in some cases, maybe are you allowed to have a nobody informed or nobody consulted? Is that allowed? So you've got a lot of rules that I have to apply. So multiple relationships between the same pair of elements, yeah, I suppose it's okay, but be prepared for some complexity and some training that you're going to need to give to people. A second kind of obscure one that we see quite a lot, because it's quite a neat feature of EA, which I rather like, is relationships just in the textual notes between elements. So if I look at this little twiddly bit here in the properties of my element, then I can say link it to something else. And the list of something else's is pretty large, as well as just the ordinary stuff like files and things like that. I can link it to another EA element. So if I did that, then where you can see requirement 2 here, then I get a hyperlink. So if I click on requirement 2, I end up looking at requirement 2. So that's quite cool. So effectively, I've created a relationship now, albeit via a hyperlink, between the requirement and requirement number 2. But it is a true hyperlink in the same way that you would see a hyperlink in web pages. If I change the name of the destination, as I have here, I've changed the name to be my other requirement, then the source up in my top requirement doesn't change. It still says requirement 2, even though the name of the thing I'm linking to has changed. Similarly, in my requirement 3 thing underneath there, that may lead to nowhere at all. I may have deleted requirement number 3. So not a perfect way of doing things, but it's kind of neat, I suppose, if you absolutely have to do it. Document generators, I don't know if all of them do, but certainly eaDocx will produce you a proper genuine hyperlink in your document if you print the details of these elements. But honestly, I wouldn't make it part of your standards if you're interested in traceability, because there is no traceability if this is the way you want to link things together. It's fine, it works, and it's okay, but really a very casual way of doing it. So here's what a next kind of relationship I might choose to create that EA lets me do. And a lot of UML languages use this technique. I don't quite know why they use it. I think you'd have to be an expert in the meta models of UML to know this, but it's relationships based on tagged values. So you can create a tagged value and say this tagged value will always link you to an element of this type. And that's perfectly allowed. That's quite okay. You'll see it in quite a few different languages. BPMN is particularly fond of doing it. The snag with doing things that way is it's a bit of a secret. So if here I have my little requirement and I say insert related elements, which by the way is the best command in EA. If anybody knows of a better one, please tell me. But in my view, this is the most powerful, the most useful single command in EA is insert related elements. It lets EA do all the hard work of saying, what am I related to? And here you go. Here's a list of things that this particular requirement is related to, some features, another requirement, a risk, and a bunch of stakeholders in that RACI kind of world. So that's great. So that's all the things that it relates to. If, though, I look at the traceability view, which I can find from the EA top menu somewhere, there's an extra thing in this traceability view that's not on the insert related elements. I've got a wee tagged value reference, it says at the bottom. So my little requirement is linked via a tagged value called QA process to business process number 1. But that doesn't appear in the insert related elements because it's related in a kind of a different secret-y kind of a way. So whilst we may have to use this if we're using something like BPMN, I don't know if SysML uses it so much. I think it does. Archimate, I'm not sure. But it may be just a thing that the language that you're using says that you have to do things this way, in which case, sorry, you have to do it. But be aware that there is definitely a link between the requirement in the top left and the business process bottom right. There's definitely a link between them, but it won't appear on any diagram. And you may have to work quite hard to remember that this is the case. There's no indication that I know of anywhere in the UI that says, hey, there's a tag value reference here somewhere. It's really only the EA traceability view which will tell you that. So it's just something to be aware of, that you've kind of, if you use this way of linking elements together using tagged values, then it's kind of a secret relationship that you've created. So be aware, you've connected the two together, but you can't see that in a diagram anywhere. So is this going to help me towards getting my traceability consistency? Probably not, but I may have to do it. So yeah, my favorite bit of EA. Next kind of relationship we'll look at is what I'm calling internal relationships. Now, these have been in EA ever since I've been using it. So long time, and they've got more and more of them over the different releases. And what it means is that pretty much any type of element can have a whole bunch of things that are composites of it, that are a part of the element. In fact, these are so old that a lot of them have their own tables in the EA schema. So they're really ancient. So this is a bit of kind of EA archaeology here. And a lot of them look really useful. So if I have a type of element there which is like a requirement, then I can say, how is it tested? Or what are the internal issues, or the changes, or the defects and the tasks connected to that element? But remember, these are composites. Most of them, I think probably all of them, don't connect to anything else. So it's like a dead end. They're all part of the element. They're not a thing in their own right. So you could describe these as second-class elements. You can print them in eaDocx documents and other documents. You can see them through the user interface. But the main thing is you can't put them in a diagram. Now, for me, EA is all about diagrams. Diagrams is the way that we see what's happening inside our models. So anything that can't appear in a diagram to me is blooming useless. I'd make a few exceptions. The constraints on the left-hand side of there really probably do belong to an element. And things like scenarios, well, the scenarios are really part of a use case, so they probably have to exist. But it's just EA's implementation that says, hey, we're going to make these into a completely separate thing that you can't put on a diagram. So it's a bit naughty, really. And I would be very interested. I can't remember, and I hope the Collaborate team, if they're listening, might be able to help me. Can you see any of this information in Collaborate? Because I don't ever remember seeing any of it, which might give you an indication of how important these things are. Because there's pretty much always an alternative. So a quick digression before I show you that. There is an inspector view in EA where you can see them all. So you can see all the discussions and the requirements and the constraints and all those kinds of bits and pieces are all visible in that view. So there's a perfectly good bit of the EA user interface, but a special strange bit of the user interface just about those kinds of things. My suspicion is this is one of those bits of EA that really only Sparks themselves use. Now, I could be wrong, but I do seem to recall in a user group presentation a few years ago in the Netherlands, asking the audience who used these kinds of bits of EA, and I think 3 hands went up out of 100. So not well used. But there are alternatives. It's not like if you want to talk about changes or risks or issues and test cases, this is all there is. No, there are perfectly good element types in EA, first-class elements that you can put on diagrams and that you can link to multiple things. They exist. I can't really think of any of those internal elements that you could not somehow make into a first-class element. So why wouldn't you? Because really, you've got to choose one way of doing it. If you're going to be consistent, if you're going to say, oh, well, we're going to have risks, we're going to document the risks or the changes or the issues in our model, how are we going to do it? Well, you either want to do it as children of each element or as first-class elements. You don't really want to be mixing the two. If you do it as on the right-hand side stuff, as first-class elements, then you can put it on a diagram. You can put it in a relationship matrix. You can join it to multiple different things. You can link it to other stuff, and life is good. The stuff on the left, well, it's just an old-fashioned, strange way of doing it. So I would say, if you're interested in traceability and you're interested in consistency, I wouldn't do it that way. You know, it's one of my least favorite bits. I'd be perfectly happy if EA took out nearly all of those bits, apart from pre and post conditions and scenarios and a couple of other things. But most of it, not great. I thought I'd better throw an extra bit in here because this is something that I've seen quite a few times where people get kind of in love with the whole idea of relationships and connecting things together, and then they find this little bit on the top right here that says I can put tagged values into my connectors. And this is great. I can put approval dates and authorization codes and all kinds of groovy things into my connector. This is often a sign, though, that what you're trying to do here is document a thing which is an element in its own right. So I think if you're saying I have an approved relationship between let's say my stakeholder and my requirement, then really is what I'm doing creating an approval element. And actually, because I'm not a big fan of that kind of UML compliant way of doing things, is it not better just to do it like I have it at the bottom there and say, this approval thing is connected to this stakeholder and this requirement. Nice and simple. So if you find that your relationships are getting a bit exotic and clever like that, maybe just make them into an element. So the final bit to look at then is what I'm going to call virtual relationships. Well, what the heck's a virtual relationship? But it's what EA is best at. And if everybody ever asks you, why is EA so much better than all the other tools? This is what you tell them, because this is the gold, this is the diamond at the middle of EA that makes it the best tool for doing what we do. This is why we all love it so much. Because if I take a diagram, and I get my little team over here, they're interested in blue triangles and red ovals, and so they draw diagrams like that. And another team, they draw diagrams like this. And they also have red things in, but they have green things as well. And another team over here are drawing green things and yellow things, and that's great. And they're all working quite happily amongst themselves, doing what they have to do, producing information for their projects. You and I know, though, this produces something magical, because I can now put all of those elements one after another onto as I've done here, onto a diagram, and they're all linked together. And that to me is the magic of EA. If there is the secret sauce of EA that says, effectively, I've created what you might call a virtual relationship between the blue triangle on the left-hand side and the yellow squarey thing on the right-hand side. And it is the best thing about EA. If you have 1 minute to explain why EA is the best thing to use to a database designer or a technical architect or an application architect or anybody else, this is the gold dust. This is what you tell them. That it may not be the best requirements management tool or the best business process design tool or the best enterprise architecture tool, but it does this. And doing this gives you insights into your business that no other single speciality tool will do. The slight drawback is virtual relationships don't exist in EA. I admit that is a slight problem. Some of you may be thinking, and because I have a special telepathic link to all of you who are listening to this, some of you are thinking, why don't I just create a connector between my blue triangle and my yellow thing? I admit, some of you were thinking that. A lot more of you are thinking, absolutely do not create a real connector between the blue triangle and the yellow thing, because that would be madness. Because I've now, if I did that, where my blue arrows are, if I build a real connector there, I've made myself an enormous problem. Because what happens if one of the intermediate links disappears? What happens if I delete my blue line? Does that mean the links in between disappear? So absolutely what I do not want to do is to create a real link instead of a virtual, because it is a virtual one. The virtual one only exists because of all the other ones. So it's a great shame EA doesn't implement this. So anybody from Sparks happens to be listening, if you could implement that, I can give you the secret sauce how to do that. It's pretty obvious. It just says my blue triangle links to an oval thing, which links to another thing and links to another thing, and here are the connections that you're allowed to have between them. So it's all pretty straightforward. This is the gold dust in terms of business insight that says something at one end of my model relates to something way at the far end of a model, and in a way that I'd never imagined exists. So it's kind of an emergent property of EA. I get it for free, just if I've done my modeling consistently all the way through. And okay, it's hard work to keep it consistent to enable this sort of stuff to happen, but it can be done. I'll give you an example where this should have happened but didn't. In a large organization that Jackie and I used to work for many years ago, Jackie was tasked with outsourcing a call center. So the call center was an organization. In theory, we should have been able to say, oh, this organization, it runs these business processes, and these business processes require these use cases, and these use cases require these software systems. Therefore, the organization needs access to all these software systems, so we can put it in the contract. Of course, the organization concerned didn't understand all those intermediate links. More importantly, though, they were not interested in the working out. So remember when you did mathematics when you were small and you got marks for showing your working out? Well, here, I don't think you do get marks for showing your working out. If your business person is interested in how the blue triangles relate to the yellow things, they probably don't care how you got there. They care that the virtual relationship exists. So we'll have a little think now about how you can maintain that consistency and how you can get some value from that virtual connection. These very complex models is keeping the hard. There's no two ways about it. They have a natural tendency to become slightly different and then a bit more different and a bit more different as time goes on. And you require work on your part, because I assume that you're some kind of EA modeling expert if you're listening to this. You have to do work to keep it consistent. The best tool I know, which coincidentally I wrote, so it's pure coincidence, and I think Sparks in version 16 are going to get better at doing this, and about time too. But you can get Model Expert to help you to analyze your model and find out how you're doing things. So you've got a chance then, if you know exactly how stakeholders and requirements are linked together and the fact they link to features and risks and they do it in this way, then you have much more chance of saying, oh my goodness me, I just looked at this project and they've got a different way of relating stakeholders and requirements. I better go train them a bit more and get them back into doing things the right way. So Model Expert will help you fix it. Hopefully, I haven't listened to Tom's presentation about EA 16, so I'm hoping there will be more stuff in there that will help us with this kind of consistency. Or you could take the nuclear option and start writing your own scripts and things, but hey, who's got that kind of time? So that's how I could maintain my consistency. I use only the sensible bits of EA. I try not to make my models too complicated. Try not to use these multiple links except where I need to. Definitely don't use the internal stuff. Try and avoid the secret links if I can, and just do things in a consistent way across the model and use tools to help me do that. So the second part then is how to make the output useful. And useful here means to the consumer of the information. So you and me, we don't get to decide what's useful. The person looking at the Collaborate view or reading the document, they're the ones who say what is useful. So that's kind of an important lesson. Go to the people who are going to be receiving this knowledge and ask them, how do they want to see it? So here's some ways that we can view this traceability information. Well, simplest way, obviously, is the traceability view that EA gives us for free. So here it is. It says my requirement number 1 is needed by a bunch of stakeholders, and there's a risk there, and that risk is needed by stakeholder number 5. Ooh, interesting. And that depends on some more risks, and down to requirement 42. So I can see all of those connectors. So each time I see an icon of an element, it's an element, and that's a connector, and that's an element, and that's a connector, and that's an element and a connector. So it's all perfectly straightforward, isn't it? My suggestion would be that's a view for an EA expert. I suspect if I show a stakeholder that view, who's maybe interested in the relationships between stakeholders and risks or requirements and other risks, it's a bit techie. So yeah, I use it all the time as an EA sort of expert. I wouldn't really say to give this to anybody who wasn't an EA expert. Collaborate shows me pretty much the same information, but in a much, much more friendly way. So better looking kind of diagrams. I wish I could show you how these things float around and you can drag them around the page and stuff. It's a much, much sexier, much more, much easier to understand kind of a view. And it's giving me, beginning to get towards what I really want, which is the insight that thing at one end of my model has a kind of a virtual link to something at the other end. Now, I didn't get a chance to listen to the Collaborate version 4 presentation yesterday, although I did got Jackie to take some notes for me, but I don't think it yet does this. So yeah, I could be misrepresenting Nizam here. By the way, remember, I am going to say something that disagrees with what Nizam said. So if you're sensitive about that kind of thing, you may want to cut down the audio now in case you don't want to hear that. So next way I can get some value from these things is documentation. Now, I know in a 21st century world of Collaborate that documentation is seen as a bit old-fashioned, but 90% of the customers I come across still produce documents because documents is what makes the world go round, definitely. So eaDocx, that well-known document generator, actually can show your readers, your information consumers, it can show them virtual connectors. So if your model has blue triangles related to yellow things via a whole bunch of stuff in the middle, you can show them in the document just a simple blue triangles relate to yellow things. And even the yellow things can have a nice little hyperlink that shows them the more detail. You don't need to talk about the stuff in between because they don't probably care about the in between. They care about the blue triangles and the yellow things. So eaDocx will let you take away all that internal complexity. It's still following the links. So defining that multi-hop relationship is a piece of work. You'll have to say blue things relate to those things in this way and relate to those things in that way and have a user's relationship to that. So you'll have to do a bit of work. But as far as the consumer of the information is concerned, they don't care. So that's all good. This is where I'm afraid I have to disagree with Nizam. He said yesterday, I think, that if you want to do collaboration using Word documents, then all you have to do is you have to put lots of comments on there and then put them into spreadsheets and stuff. Well, you don't, remember, Nizam. With the eaDocx, you can create a document that people can collaborate on. You can send all of the different versions of those Word documents with comments and changes on into eaDocx Revision Manager, and it will make sense of them all and even make the changes in EA for you. So that's just a bit of a side issue. So see me afterwards, Nizam. And finally, final view of getting value from these relationships is there is a model expert view called the Advanced Relationship Matrix, where you can take the same definition of the multi-hop relationships, that A links to B, which links to C, which links to D, and show it as just a simple matrix of A relates to D, without all the intermediate stuff. Now, obviously, you can't edit it because what you'd be editing would be 15 connectors across 14 different elements potentially. But at least it shows you that the relationship exists. Now, again, this might be in future versions of Collaborate. I don't know. I don't think it's in EA at the moment at all. So it is possible to use connectors in a sensible way if you keep it simple and get good value from all this work you're doing in EA from these end-to-end kind of traceability views, and get value out of EA, and maybe in ways that you didn't even think you would. So here's, just to finish off with, a few of my kind of personal rules for using connectors in a sensible way. First of all, reuse before you invent. Understand what those UML connector types mean and use them in the way that the inventors of that intended. And if you have to produce stereotypes, then okay, but don't let everybody do it. The second that we talked about is just use an ordinary connector. Ordinary connectors and first-class elements you can put on a diagram. If you can, avoid the tagged value ones. The textual ones are just there for a bit of fun, really, just a bit of readability, but don't use it, and really don't use those internal relationship things because it's a dead end in terms of information. You're going to have to work hard to maintain the consistency of your models. That's not free. You don't get this end-to-end traceability thing for nothing. Even if you start being able to do it, it won't last. So you're going to need a model expert or similar tools. And again, I'm hoping that EA16 will have some more management stuff that will help us all to do this. In the meantime, model expert can help you to do that. It's a free download, by the way, so there's no excuse for not using it. And finally, you're going to have to get the consumers of your information to tell you how they want to see it. So yes, there is a role here for smart documents that squash up what these relationships represent. There's model expert that let you see that in a relationship matrix, probably not an end user kind of tool. And there's Collaborate. And Collaborate gets better and better with every release at letting people see this kind of information. So if you do all those things, then I think there's a good chance that your models will be more useful than you think they will be. You can still produce good models for individual projects, but when you add all the bits together, you'll get something even smarter. And that's really, to me, what EA is all about. It's about working smarter. So that's about all I'm going to say. Back to Dewey, I think, to see if there are any questions I can answer in the last 5 minutes or so. If anybody's still there. So if anybody has any questions, then please put them into Teams, and I'm hoping somebody will ask them to me.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So we have a couple of discussions initiated by participants, which may need a detailed discussion from you. So we have pasted those topics over there in Teams, so you can take it forward from there.
Okay. Okay. Well, if that's how we're going to do it, then I will say goodbye.
After the session. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll go into the Teams now and get into the discussions if I can find the right part of Teams.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Okay. Thanks everyone for your time during the session, and I hope this session gave deeper insights. Now the speaker will be available in MS Teams to have a detailed discussions and take the conversations further. The link to Microsoft Teams is pasted in the chat window for your reference again. The recording of this video will be available in eaglobalsummit.com with complete Q&A and discussions after the summit, and we will be notifying you all by email once it is made available. Thanks once again, everyone, and thanks, Ian, for your time and efforts.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Bye-bye.